Hi folks, welcome to another video over here on the YouTube channel. Good to see you, hope you're doing alright. You will have seen that this is going to be quite a long video. Today I'm sort of doing a follow-on from the previous video I put up on the channel where we were looking at highlight reconstruction. And yes, we were working in Darktable, and I'm sat here in Lightroom. I make no apologies for that because we are going to be working in Lightroom quite a bit. But don't let that put you off if you're not a Lightroom user, because it's all relevant, because this is all about camera dynamic range. Yes, it is. And yeah, I did a video on this, 3, 4, maybe 5 years ago. And people tend to forget what videos any YouTube channel operator has put up in the past, and so I'm going to just use this as a way of reminding you of a simple technique for finding your dynamic range of your camera. And we're going to start off here with a shot from Steve, one of my Patreon members, who sparked off a further conversation and a further video that I did for my Patreon members last week on dynamic range and joined up thinking. And so this is sort of going to be a follow-on from that and the previous YouTube channel video. So what are we here to discuss? Right, well, first off, nice shot, Steve. Steve shot this on his Canon EOS R5, and a nice job of it he did as well. Lovely jubbly. We are at 100%. It's got a little bit of noise in it, but at the end of the day, that's nothing that a bit of AID noise over in Lightroom can't take care of. But let's come back to the original shot. And does this look like the original shot? Answer, no. We'll go to reset settings, and there we go. There's the original RAW file, straight in Lightroom with Lightroom's background junkie operation or background operations on it. We'll do a process version swap, put the exposure back, put the contrast back. And that's basically our main starting point, which doesn't look as good as the finished article. However, what's this got to do with dynamic range, Andy? Well, everything. When you photograph kingfishers, you are always painfully aware of this little part of a kingfisher, this white rear cheek flash, and it is a pain in the backside. Now, if we look at Steve's text, where he shot this at -1 EV, which is quite a common thing that I would expect most people to do, basically because they don't know what's recoverable in their shots in terms of highlights. So this is where I want to sort of go with this video. There is a difference, and everybody seems to get this mixed up. They think it's one and the same thing. Highlight recovery and highlight reconstruction. They are two entirely separate things. A lot of people like to lump them together, but really and truly it is a big mistake. Now, in the previous video, you saw where we got what looked like blown highlights, which were actually blown in all 3 channels. That shot of the waterfall in Iceland, which was totally unreconstructable, and the overexposed blown out sun, which was fully reconstructable using guided Laplacians over in Darktable. And what a wonderful job they did too. Now then, with regards to dynamic range, Steve, as I said, has done what most people would do and gone for -1 EV. Now, the thing is, the meter has metered this scene in, is it matrix on a Canon? And it's come to a decision about tonal values, and then it's underexposed by 1 stop, deliberately, because that's what Steve's put in, exposure bias -1 EV. to save himself from blowing this cheek piece. Now, the thing is, what we need to do is we need to get an idea of what dynamic range actually is. And this is the dynamic range of my Nikon D4. And it's unadjusted. This is straight out of the calculator. I've used the Seconic data transfer software to actually produce this. But in order to produce this graph, you've got to own something like a Seconic L758DR light meter, which is going to cost you a few £100, and then you've got to own the calibration test chart as well, which is quite expensive and quite rare and difficult to get hold of. The thing you've got to remember about dynamic range is it's basically clip points, where if you go any further past here, it doesn't record any variation of tone, and the output level is 255 in the highlights, and therefore it is unrecoverable, but it is reconstructible potentially, and I do stress the word potentially. So I always like to err on the side of caution and make that 254, rather like that. And you can see that according to this test chart sequence that's been processed here, I've got a dynamic range of 8.7 stops. Okie dokie. Right. Now, the thing you've got to remember is this. If we go to somewhere like the internet and look at Steve's camera, the Canon R5, has a maximum dynamic range of 14.6 EV, which is just junk. Canon R5 225 stops of dynamic range? Yeah, that'd be interesting, wouldn't it? But I know it's just not true. Believe me, it isn't. God's truth. I don't know how they come up with these numbers, I really don't. Well, I do actually, and I did show my Patreon members in a Patreon members video, which I put up last week, which I did make reference to earlier. The thing is this. What is real dynamic range? Well, you could go to Photons to Photos, and here's my Nikon D4 as a plot, and what I'll do is I'll just go and put Steve's R5 on, which is what I compared mine to earlier in the Patreon members video, and you can see that fundamentally the dynamic range between the old D4 and the new R5 isn't really all that much. So it is the R5 I've got there, isn't it? Yes. So anyway, we're not concerned with Steve's dynamic range because we're going to be testing the Nikon D4. And so at base ISO, which is 100, it says here that the Nikon D4 has got a photographic dynamic range of 10.38 stops. That's as opposed to an engineering dynamic range, which is what DxO Marco always quote. And yeah, less said about that, the better. But the thing is, it tells you what the dynamic range is, but you don't know how to interpret that dynamic range value, because it just says, right, there's 10.38 stops between its black clipping point and its white clipping point. But you don't know what that looks like, and you don't know how to relate your midtones to that either. So what we need to do is to get some idea of the distribution of that dynamic range. And so, of course, we come to this, okay, which does show a slightly decreased dynamic range from that quoted 8.7 stops. This is the thing to remember about dynamic range and how it has to relate to black near whites and midtones. This is the thing, and you can prove this to yourself all day long in any situation. Whatever you point your camera's light meter at, whatever tone it sees, because it's not interested in colour, it fundamentally sees in black and white. And so it sees a grey value somewhere between fully black and fully white. And what it will always do is the tone that it analyses and gets an average of, whether you're on spot meter, matrix metering, partial metering, or whatever, doesn't really matter. All it's doing, it's taking a measurement of the average tonal value that it sees, and then it's going to give you an exposure value which is going to expose it as a midtone. So you can point your camera at the black cat in the coal house at midnight, which is going to be very dark, and left to its own devices, your camera is going to expose that near black as a midtone. You could then go up to the Arctic Circle and point your camera at a polar bear in a snowstorm, and it's going to see something that is very, very nearly white, and it's still going to expose it as a midtone. If you go and point it at a proper midtone, it's going to expose that as a proper midtone, and that would be a good thing. But unless you're photographing something which is middle grey, your exposure for that subject or tone is not going to be right. What you need to do to make the best use of your dynamic range availability is to expose your midtones as midtones, your shadows as shadows, and so they fall down here, and your highlights as highlights, so they fall up here. And that is the way you make the best use of the dynamic range that you've got available to you. So the other thing you have to remember, as ISO increases, I was looking at 1000 ISO there, we should be looking at 100. So this is me backtracking now. So where Photons to Photos said that we got a dynamic range for the D4 at base ISO of 10.38, our base ISO that I measured was 9 EV. Okay, so there you go. So it's still a little bit generous over at Photons to Photos, because what you have to remember is they don't sit and measure all these points off real photographs. This is nothing but an exercise in data extrapolation and calculation, or data calculation and then extrapolation. It's more accurate than what you'll find on DxOMark, but it's not as accurate as measuring it for real. And so if I come back to this, and then I come back to this, I'm never really bothered about my shadows, because I can always bracket. But the only thing is, if you don't get your highlights in the right place, then everything else is going to be underexposed, or the highlights are going to be blown. If you expose the highlights over here, then they're going to be blown and unreconstructable, let alone unrecoverable. But it'll be good for your midtones because it'll overexpose your midtones, and it'll be good for your shadows because it'll overexpose your shadows, and then all you need to do is turn them down. So it's a balancing act. It's a little bit like a cross between trying to persuade a camel through the eye of a needle and playing pin the tail on the donkey. You've got to get your highlights metered correctly so that they are just below your clipping point on the right hand side of your dynamic range, or on the highlight side of your dynamic range, and that will always benefit your midtones and your shadows. If we go back to Steve's shot, Steve underexposed this by one stop. He didn't really need to do that, and he knows he didn't need to do that, but he doesn't know the actual dynamic range distribution of his camera. And so, you know, I mean, he's just been on the erring on the side of caution, let's put it like that. And better to be safe than sorry. However, there is a lot easier way of finding out the dynamic range of your camera for any ISO setting, because ISO settings, as you increase ISO, notice we'll go from 9 stops to 8.7 stops, and then if we go to 8000 we go down to 6 and a bit stops. So you see, dynamic range will always reduce as ISO is increased. So you've really got to know, especially at higher ISOs, where your highlight clipping point really is. It's a lot easier than you think, because you don't need £300–500 for this L758 DR meter, and you don't need to spend £100 plus on the exposure value target either. What are the exposure value targets? I'll just minimise that, and we'll come down to collections, and here we go, DR2, there we go. So this is my exposure profile target 2, which I never use because it's faulty, because that tone there should be over here and this tone here should be over there. Yeah, bad news. I ought to get my money back for that, but I just can't be bothered because I didn't pay full price for that. This is the target that I use, but you can see it's getting a bit textured down here because it is so old, and your registration blocks here are glossy, so there is a little bit of surface reflection on this, so that's why when I produce these charts they're always a little bit on the conservative side, but you know, I mean, it is what it is, and that's not really relevant. So what I am going to suggest you do, because anybody can do this for their camera, and it is really, really simple. If we go over to Photoshop, and you don't have to do this in Photoshop, you could do it in GIMP or whatever, what you need to do is create yourself a big document, alright, and fill it with something like Lab 49, LAB 49. It is just that simple. It's middle grey, if you like, because these exposure targets, if I go back to Lightroom, this here is supposed to be Lab 49. Well, it's actually Lab 49.7. So there you go, that's middle grey, commonly referred to as an 18% grey card, made by good old Kodak back in the days of film. Yes, the good old days. Where were we? What am I going to do? Yes, Photoshop. Make yourself this document and then take it up to 100%, so it's bigger than your screen, and just hit the F key and then hit the F key again. And so you end up with this flat grey area. And don't forget, it's Lab 49 or L channel 49, which I suggest you fill it with. Now then, what you want to do is get your camera, and I actually use a 105 macro lens, Nikon 105 macro lens, and I focus it at infinity and then set it at f8 and whatever ISO I'm working with to try and ascertain my dynamic range, and then fundamentally I put the camera about a foot away from the screen and I shoot 55 shots. You don't need all 55, but it's best to shoot them in the first place. From an 8,000th of a second to 30 seconds, which is my total shutter speed range on the camera, which equates to, I think it's 18.3 stops, I think it is, 55 shots at 1/3 of a stop increments. Real easy. And what you end up with, just hit escape for that. If I come back to Lightroom, what you end up with is these, and you can see that D4, and I go to library view like that and thumbnail view. You can see here's all 55 shots, 1/3 of a stop apart from an 8,000th of a second at that one. There you go, 8,000th of a second through to 30 seconds, as you can see there. Okay, same ISO, same aperture. Massively out of focus because it's focused at infinity and taken from about a foot away. So what we end up with is a nice, even, smooth tone. So we can't see the individual pixels on the screen, which is what would happen if we were actually in focus. The only thing is it does contain the natural vignetting of the lens, so what I suggest you do is use the best aperture for maximum vignette reduction on the particular lens that you're using. So there you go. And really and truly what we're interested in is the centre 50% of the image, but we'll come to that in a minute. Now, as you can see, I've done a set for 100 ISO, which is base ISO. I've done a set for 1000 ISO, and I've also done a set for 10,000 ISO. Alrighty, so let's go and have a look at what's happening at 100 ISO on Uncle Andy's D4 camera. So these are sitting here in Lightroom. Just forget the stars and the red labels for a moment. And all we're going to do is bring them over into the develop module. And here's the first one. And all we need to do is make sure that, for starters, it's at Adobe's default processing. And I want to make sure that I've got both my clipping indicators turned on. So this is an 8,000th of a second, and you can see that it is fully clipped in the black regions. And so all we need to do is start to step through them. And we can step through them quite quickly and just make sure that we are still clipping. You're still clipping there, and keep going. And are we still clipping? Now you can see that we are vignetting. All right, we can see the clipping in the vignetting, but it's a lot of people would assume, because we're in a fit to screen view, that we've got no clipping in the center. Yes, we have. So if we keep going, and have we got clipping? Your video compression might not show you this, but there are one or two little blue flecks in the middle portion of the image still. So we'll go one further, and at ISO 100, 125th of a 125th of a second at f8 produces no black clipping, no clipped shadows. That is the starting point, or the left hand edge of our 100 ISO dynamic range for this particular camera. So where we are is just about, I'd say, there, 4.4. So we need to be because don't forget all these shots are at 1/3 stop increments. So 4.4 minus a third of a stop would be minus 4.1. And so there we go. So this shot is sitting there where that green arrow is, or that green vertical line. Okie dokie. So what we need to do now is to scoot across and come to the whites, all right, or the overexposed shots. and you can see that the histogram is all the way over here to the right, but we've got no clipping, and we are still viewing the center of the image at 100%. Let's move to the next one. Have we got any clipping? It says we've got a little bit of clipping, but to be honest with you, I cannot see where that clipping is. It says it's in all three channels, but I've got the histogram with show lab color values activated, and you can see that that's lab 99.7. So where are we now? Let's go to the next shot, and yeah, you can see that that is clipped. All right, even though we've still got a little bit of vignetting going on there, that's irrelevant. We're only concerned with the center of the image, and so we are fully clipped. So where is this shot on our dynamic range? This shot is past this red line. Okay, it is to the right of this red line. Really and truly, that red line shouldn't be at 255, it should be at 254. Okay, and why should it be at 254? I'll tell you in a second. Right, so that's where we are there, and we will come back one, and so I can still see no clipping on there. So we are, if you like, still on this red line, but we are really, oh God, so close to it, it's unreal. So, why 254? All right, well, I'll show you over in Photoshop, and I will come to here, and all I've got is a white square, or white rectangle, with a levels adjustment layer over the top. I'll turn the levels adjustment layer off, and you can see that that white square or white rectangle is 255. So I'll now activate the levels layer, but nothing's been done, and all I'm going to do is get the midpoint slider and slide it over there. And what the hell's gone on there, Andy? Yes, well, this is still 255, and 255 is unrecoverable. This over here never was 255. As you can see by the histogram readout, it was actually 254, and we've recovered it down to 187. If I turn that levels adjustment off, just to prove the point, that's 255. That is actually 254. Video compression might actually be showing this as visibly slightly darker. So what you need to do is, if you've got Photoshop, you actually want to go and do this exercise for yourself. Just fill a square with 255, draw a rectangular marquee across half of it, fill that rectangular marquee with 254, and you end up with this. Put the levels adjustment layer on it and slide the midtone slider all the way over to the right, and this is what you will see. So 254 is recoverable, 255 isn't. Alrighty, so that is why I always, when I create these dynamic range profiles, because the thing is, I can feed this profile into my light meter, and it plots it out as points along the bottom of the light meter's LCD. So I can take a reading of the highlight, which it will then want to, where's my little picture again? So I can meter the brightest part of a scene. Not that I'd be doing this with my D4, I'd be doing this with my D800E, or a D850 if I could find one, and or if I could afford one, I should say. But what I will do is I will meter the brightest part of the sky with a 1 degree spot meter, and the meter itself will actually, because we're doing reflected light, it will actually give me an exposure for a mid-tone, or exposing this highlight as a mid-tone. But then what I can do is, with the jog wheel on the side of the meter, I can say, right, this highlight, I need to move it up 1, 2, 3, 3 and a little bit. Stops, I'll pin it there, and so it will give me a different exposure value on the meter, which I can then dial into the camera, and the camera's light meter is going, and the histogram in the back of the camera is going potty, and he's putting blinkies all over the shot. But I know when I bring that into Lightroom, Raw Therapy or Darktable, I'm going to be able to pull back all of the sky, because everything I've recorded has got a density of 254, not 255. Alrighty. So, let's get back to good old Lightroom, shall we? Alrighty. So, this is the white end of our dynamic range. Okay, you could say it's that end, but no, I'll be generous and I'll call it there. So I'm going to come back to library, and here it is, and you can see I've already marked them out. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. So that's 7 stops because they're in third stop increments. 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 9 stops and 1 third. So it is 9.3 stops of dynamic range. Alrighty, so there's my dynamic range for 100 ISO on the Nikon D4, and quite simply, if I go through my shots and I look for the one where this is nearest, because I've got lab activated in the histogram panel, I can look for the nearest to 49, and there you go. Lab 49, see, depending where I am, I just hit a 49 value somewhere. There you go. Yep, alright. So this is my, if you like, correct exposure, because the target that I set in Photoshop over here is lab 49. Alrighty, so that's how you get some sort of correlation. So if we know that that is lab 49, this one, let's go and add a pick flag to it by hitting P. Right, so how many stops of dynamic range have I got over to the right, so I can expose to the right accurately? ETTR. Right, so let's come back to library again, and there's our pick flag. So I know I can come 1, 2, 3, there's 1 stop, 1, 2, 3, 2 stops, 1, 2, 3, 3 stops, 1, 2, 3, 4 stops. So I know that I can comfortably expose my highlights if I meter them with my camera's spot meter set to its lowest diameter possible, and I can accurately get a meter reading off my brightest highlight in this scene. I know that then I can go +4 EV, and I will not blow my highlights, but I will be giving an extra 4 stops of exposure to my midtones and an extra 4 stops of exposure to my shadows. Yes, which is always a good thing. That's providing nothing's moving. Alright, so welcome to the world of metering and dynamic range for landscape photography. Okay, that was base ISO. Let's go for 1000 ISO. I've marked out where the clipping ends, and let's go back into the develop module. And have I got any clipping on there? Could be said no. because I've got no clipping indicator on. But whether you'll be able to see these or not, I don't know. But there's about 50 pixels there, randomly distributed. So there's a possibility there could be noise, random noise. But, you know, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there's still clipping there, because I could see little flecks of blue. But like I say, it could be noise. So, as I said, I'm always on the cautious side. I err on the side of conservatism, yes. You could count that as part of the dynamic range. Could we count that? I suppose we could, because we haven't got the clipping indicator turned on. There. Still no clipping indicator. There. Yeah, now we're clipping in the red channel. All right. So you could extend this dynamic range that we've got marked off here, or that you're going to see in a minute, by a stop in the shadows. So just bear that in mind. But if we come back to our library and go back there, so this is at 1000 ISO on the D4. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 7 1/3 stops. All right, of dynamic range. It could actually be construed as 8 1/3 stops, if you want to be erring on the side of optimism. Yeah. But, you know, it is what it is, isn't it? But again, where is our mid-tone? It's probably going to be this one. Take that into the develop module. Lab 50.6. Yeah, that'll do. So that will be our middle grey, or our mid-tone. And so how many stops have we got available to us in our highlights? Let's come back to a library grid view. We'll put a pick flag on that. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, so we've got like 3 1/3 stops, or 3 2/3 of a stop of dynamic range above our midtones here. So what I'll do is I will go to 1000 ISO, which is what we shot it at. Okay, so our midpoint is already set here, because 118 is pretty much the same as Lab 49, and so our dynamic range would actually be 3 and a bit, or 3 and 2 bits. Okay, so it's actually going to start clipping around about 250. So, you know, you've just got to be a little bit careful, but we've definitely got a good 7.5 to 7.8 stops of dynamic range recorded on this chart. And, you know, I mean, 7 1/3 calculated over here in Lightroom. And if we go and look at, lastly, we go and look at 10,000 ISO. And where are we here? Let's come to the highlights, go back into the develop module. Have we got any clipping there? A little bit. It's saying I can't actually see it. Oh, look there. Yes, I can see it. So yes, we've got clipping in the center of the image. And yeah, so we were right in the first place. There's the start of our dynamic range over on the right hand side of the dynamic range chart at 10,000 ISO. And if we come back over to the library and click down there, that's where it ends. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 down to mid-tone, because that is pretty much Lab 49. Well, it's Lab sort of 50, 51-ish, but give or take, that's your mid-tone. And if we count the rest of the stops down to our black clip, you will see that we've got 6.6 or 6 2/3 of a stop of dynamic range at 10,000 ISO. And our clip, our white point would still be, where are we? Go over to develop module, 99, lab 99, yeah. So, you know, you can go a long way to preserving your highlights at very, very high ISOs and adopting an exposed to the right workflow when you're out taking your pictures with a lot of reliability, just as long as you've done this exercise yourself in the first place at home with your own camera and your own screen, so you've got the numbers in your head, or write them down on a bit of paper. It's dead simple. So you need to know where your brightest recoverable highlight is, where your deepest recoverable shadow is, which is there, and pretty much you need to know where your midtone is, which is there, which would be your EV0, if you like. So if we come back to this, I mean, this isn't for 10,000 ISO. We switch it up to the 8,000 ISO one, and so you will be able to ascertain this point, and this point for free, just using your camera and Lightroom, Raw Therapy or Darktable. But I actually prefer to use Lightroom because it's a lot simpler than doing it in Raw Therapy or Darktable. So anyway, there you go, guys and gals. A bit convoluted, you know, make of it what you will. It is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It's a test and a set of test results that any single person viewing this video can go and do for their own cameras right now. So instead of listening to me, bugger off and do it. Alright, guys and gals, thanks a lot for your time. Thanks for watching the video. If you've enjoyed it, don't forget to tell your friends about it. Give us a thumbs up, share it. If you've enjoyed it very much and found it very useful, leave us a nice comment below. Don't leave any nasty ones. And until the next time, stay safe, stay well, keep taking the pictures, don't do anything I wouldn't do, gives you plenty of scope, and I'll see you next time. Tooroo.